Phyllis Weisberg. Good morning. Or I guess it's afternoon now. My name is Phyllis Weisberg. I'm a partner with the law firm of Montgomery, McCRACKEN. Many of you may know me from my prior life, where I was a partner in the firm of Kurzman, Carlson, and Frank. In March 2012, all the partners of Kurzman Carlson became partners in Montgomery, so that's how I ended up there. Kurzman Carlson had the distinction of probably being the first firm in the city to be representing co-ops and involved in representing co-op and then condo boards. We have clients that we have been representing since the 1940s that were co-ops way back then and remain among our clients. So we have been very much involved in the co-op condo field. I am currently chair of the co-op and condo committee of the City Bar, which is a beautiful building a little bit further down the block here, and where we're very actively involved in all aspects of co-op and condo representation, and trying to change some of the laws, and also learning everything we can to help our clients. Margie has asked me today to speak about two separate topics. One is the recently enacted legislation, Local Law 98, which was Intro 1085, and she's also asked me to address some issues about mold. They are somewhat interrelated. So let me start with the Local Law 98, which was enacted in November 19th. Greg, I think you said it's effective immediately. It's actually 180 days. Just almost immediately. Sandy exposed a lot of vulnerabilities. I don't know how many of you here are involved in buildings that actually sustain damage, but I think it was a storm that none of us could have quite imagined and no one expected. One of the impacts of Sandy was the formation of something called the Building Resiliency Task Force. It was a body of over 200 members, all volunteering their time, consisting of real estate owners, property managers, architects, contractors, subject matter experts, city officials, code consultants, et al. Under the auspices of the Urban Green Council, the members of the task force were appointed in consultation with the mayor and Speaker Quinn. They came up with a series of proposals, 4 of which have now been enacted into law. What's been enacted includes a provision that, that's much better, thank you. A provision that will remove some of the barriers to installing standby generators in buildings. There's another law that was enacted that will remove some of the barriers to putting up sidewalk flood protection. There's also one of the laws that was enacted deals with providing water in buildings that use electric pumps. That will become effective, and it is retroactive. It applies to existing buildings. That will become effective in 8 years. So you have 8 years to retrofit, but it will be that each building will have to supply at least one source of water for every 100 residents. And that will be presumably from the city main. We're assuming the mains will still be in operation. So any building that has an electric pump will comply. The law that Margie asked me to speak about today, Local Law 98, is a little bit different. It has 2 parts. The first part is really directed at the city. It directs the Office of Emergency Management to coordinate with other city agencies to develop guidelines for residential and commercial buildings to deal with weather emergencies and utility outages. And it enumerates some of those topics that should be looked at, which I guess gives you some idea about some regulations that may be coming down the pike eventually. Has to do with flood zones, evacuation zones, protective measures to be installed against flooding, advice on securing window air conditioning units, patio furniture, some things that are fairly obvious, I would think, but regulations on that, how to rent pumps and generators after an outage, methods to communicate with tenants during outages, and the list goes on. There's a very nice discussion of it on the Urban Green Council website, which is urbangreencouncil, all one word, .org. The second part of the law is directed at buildings. And as I said, it will be effective in 180 days, and it directs the owner of residential buildings to post notices. The notices are about whether the building is in a hurricane zone, and if so, which zone it is in, a hurricane evacuation zone, excuse me. The address of the nearest evacuation center, when a person should contact 911 or 311 during a weather event or an extended utility outage, whether during an extended utility outage the building will provide services such as water, which brings us back to the other law that's not going to be effective for some time, but that's one of the issues, whether during the utility outage there will be egress lighting, fire protection, elevators, charging locations for cell phones, heating, cooling, contact information for building personnel during an emergency, instructions on removing furniture from rooftops and balconies during high wind events. I would hope everybody here is already doing that, and that we don't need, you know, and that when storms are coming and hurricanes are coming, that's just sort of part of routine management to deal with that. And the last item that the notices have to deal with, for buildings that do utilize pumps, instructions on reducing water consumption during extended power outages. These are temporary signs. They're supposed to be posted prior to the expected arrival of a weather emergency or after the owner is informed of a utility outage that is expected to last over 24 hours. And there'll be a template to be published by the city in terms of what these signs look like, and they are to be removed after the event has passed. These guidelines, they're mandatory, and therefore they're no enforcement action because everybody should have it up. I'm assuming that means you'll get a violation if you don't, and you'll be fined, and you have to deal with ECB or whoever else it is. You know, in some ways you can say, okay, so we now have new legislation that says we have to put up signs. Big deal, what does that do? I think what it does is it makes you think about what happens during an emergency. How are we going to be prepared? What are we going to think about as opposed to being reactive? It means think ahead. Think about a plan. Think about the elderly in your building. You know, these buildings are communities, and they are home for the residents. The board should be concerned about providing that sense of community and caring and worrying about people there. So the management people and the boards should be focusing now, legislation or not, on what happens. I mean, we've had blackouts in the city. I know I've had buildings that have had fires in them when the emergency stairwell lighting has failed, and there have been terrible smoke conditions. I've had buildings that have had very, very serious floods. I had one building where a standpipe burst and had about 12 floors of apartments trashed. And all kinds of services in the building, including elevators, had to be shut off. These things happen. They're not just weather emergencies. And I think that as much as you don't want to think about the worst case scenario, this is a reminder that we have to start thinking that way if we're not already doing it. And it's important that we focus on it. So this new legislation, it's just posting a sign, but that sign should make you start thinking about what are we going to do? How are we going to do it? Margie mentioned that there's a training program for building staff, and I think it's really important. We have these storms. It seems that we have more serious storms more frequently. There's a lot of construction going on in the city. You all know about the crane and how 2 employees of the Department of Buildings had to secure it during Sandy. One of whom has told me to this day he doesn't have a clue as how he made it up there, other than he didn't look down. But there's a lot of construction. I had, during Hurricane Sandy, one of my buildings was a relatively tall building that had had some serious building conditions, and it was undergoing some local 11 work. And because of the wind tunnel effects where this building is located, the contractor was sufficiently concerned that the night of Sandy he spent out on the roof to make sure that all the building materials and everything was secure. I thought that was a fairly amazing story. He said, I had to do it. I had to make sure that everything was properly secured given what the predictions were. So I think we need to focus, we need to plan ahead so that at the last minute you don't have somebody really potentially risking his life out on a roof to take care of that. So I think it's really important. It's a wake-up call, and we should all focus on it. Now also, in terms of planning, there are several other things you might want to think about, which is you have a building office and all the important records are there. What if it's in the basement or the ground floor and you have a flood? What happens to your building records? Do you have documents that are important scanned in? And are they off-site? Are they protected someplace? Do you know what your insurance covers? Jay's clients are going to make sure that you have insurance that they're happy with, but make sure it covers you as well. What does your business interruption insurance look like? Take a look at it. Insurance companies look for excuses not to cover. Some insurance policies have provisions that if there are 2 causes of damage and one of them is not covered, then the loss is not covered. Some insurance companies do not have such a provision, so be aware of that when you're looking at your insurance. Make sure you've looked at your physical plant to deal with potential vulnerabilities down the road. Again, Jay's clients want you to maintain your building, and you want to maintain your building. It's obviously quality of life for your residents, it's protection of the value of an asset, but also it's to avoid damage in one of these extreme situations. If you've been applying Band-Aids to the facade and you get hit with a Hurricane Sandy, what's going to happen? You're much more likely to sustain serious damage than if you have protected the integrity of the facade. So really, I think we have to focus on those kinds of things, how we can be prepared. Now, on to mold. Because if you're not prepared, or even if you are, you may end up with water intrusion. And I think the way you have to think about water intrusion is anytime there's water intrusion, you have to think of mold. Mold may be a 4-letter word, but you got to think about it and how to deal with it. There's an outline, I think, that was handed out. This is sort of a reprise of a talk I gave several years ago for Margie, and there's a lot of legal information in here, which I'm not going to bore you with. You can take it with you and read it. And it gives you some resources because EPA and the Department of Health resources on mold. The idea is to avoid mold as best you can, which means that moisture control. You can't ignore any kind of moisture penetration. I have, beginning on page 3 of the outline, 4 steps. One is education, how you can educate your staff, as well as your residents and unit owners. Step 2 is a program of routine inspections and maintenance. Take a look, know what's going on. Don't ignore situations that exist. The third step is to develop the appropriate protocols. Just as we're talking about protocols for weather emergencies and for blackouts, you need protocols in place for water and mold remediation. Basically, the first thing you want to make sure you do is get the place dried out within 24 to 48 hours. If you can do that, you're probably going to avoid having a mold problem. And if you don't do that, it's going to be a problem for you. One of my clients had local law 11 work done, and unbeknownst to everyone, in the course of doing it, the contractor had pierced some heating pipes, which were, the contractor wasn't working off the as-built drawings. And in anchoring parts of the facade, it actually pierced the pipes. When the heating system was turned on at the beginning of the heating system, and the water started running through the pipes, I believe there were 50 apartments that were flooded. Many of them were unoccupied at the time, the tenants were out of town, whatever. Massive problem. 24 to 48 hours to dry out 50 apartments is just not doable. The board and the managing agent, upon learning of the problem, immediately called in a company to first do triage, see which apartments were the worst, and then start work. Fight about, obviously they notified their insurer, but they immediately started working in apartments and doing what they could, but picking out the order. So if you can't do it in 24 to 48 hours, at least, you know, pick out which apartments are the most damaged, deal with those first, and then go through. And they had actually an organized list. It was a condominium. There were arguments about, you know, who's responsible for paying for what and everything. And the board said, the heck with everything. We got to deal with the situation. We'll fight over liability down the road. And it all worked out fine. There was not one lawsuit over it. Insurance company actually stepped up to the plate, and it was okay. There was mold in some of the apartments. It was taken care of. I remember a call from one of the board members who said he had a mushroom growing on his wall. And unfortunately, that was the case. But you can deal with it. And so try for the 24, 48 hours. If not, you got to do your triage or whatever. That raises an issue, by the way, that in buildings where the leak is in one unit, something like that, and you have people who are snowbirds or what have you, there should be some kind of protocol for checking on apartments. Some buildings actually require people who are out of town for an extended period of time to have the name of provide the name of someone who is going to check on their apartment on a regular basis, because if they're not reporting the damage to you quickly, then there may be mold growing. The last item is on your record keeping. And I have, now that my firm is part of Montgomery, I have the luxury of having a number of partners who handle environmental issues. I have one partner who goes throughout the country advising and defending against mold claims, but he advises on various entities, and he's done it for some of my co-ops as well, on how to avoid those claims. Another one deals with oil spills, and they're very concerned, and they've told me some horror stories about building records. You should keep records of what you did, but there should not be any speculation about the cause of a condition or the possible adverse health facts. It's, as they used to say, and you know, on TV, the facts, ma'am, nothing but the facts. So it's, this is the day it occurred, this is what we did, this is the professional who was involved, and that the work is been completed, and we've now done testing after the work and confirmed that everything is okay. So that's really a very important part, but somebody has to focus on what's going into that record keeping. The record keeping will be very important down the road if there are any claims made, but if it has, the record keeping has what I would call editorial comment or speculation, it's only going to get you in trouble. So hopefully you're going to keep your buildings in terrific shape and you're never going to have to deal with mold, but if you do, these are the steps you should take. And I have, in the back of the outline is something that is been published by EPA with a variety of steps that you can take as well, and what the various protocols are will help you develop it. That's it.
That you keep track of all your activities once mold is detected. And that is the beauty of fast information. Because when you do this, NYARM sells these for $150 each. I recommend that every maintenance worker should have one in their back pocket. So it's at the moment they see something they don't like. We don't know what it is. They take a swab of it, okay? Very simple. It goes there. The instructions in the past were, you go back to your office, you get some Scotch tape, try to tape it up there. It's very difficult to do. And then find a lab who's going to take it from you. So these are prepaid, $150. Then your cost, you overnight it to the lab in Texas. The next day, within 24 hours, you get an email of the result. We test for over 150 organisms. This is not asbestos or lead or anything like that. So it's something that is an organism. So when this is over, in the back, if you would raise your hand, Roger and Marty, okay? Roger and Marty are here. They're the principals of the company, and they'll be able to talk to you about it. And I would also like to introduce Great Eastern Energy, who will keep you in compliance with all your energy issues, okay? And we have Recovery Judgment, which is a law firm that specializes in collections, and that applies to everyone here. So whether you own a company that works for a building, or if you are a building, you can use their services, okay? And then this table right here, the four gentlemen can raise your hand. There's Howard and Hecht is one of the companies, and Continuity Dynamics, please talk to them afterwards, because what they do is exactly what Phyllis was talking about with reference to the emergency plans that you have to create in the continuity of your building or your business during an emergency. Okay, that's that. And so at this point, 32BJ to give us an essence of what they're training the staff.
Thank you for having me, Margie. My name is Richard Harris. I'm from the 32BJ Training Fund. We are a separate nonprofit 401c3 from the union. We train exclusively local 32BJ members. So your superintendents, your resident managers, and your commercial cleaners are just some of the members that we have here in the city. After Hurricane Sandy last year, both management and the union came together about what to do with disaster preparedness. We know that a lot of management companies had some plans, but a lot didn't have disaster manuals or anything in place that would help them before, during, and after an emergency. So we've set up a class for that. It's a 3-hour seminar. It's not meant to be exhaustive. It's just meant to get the ball rolling, the conversation started, so that before the next emergency happens, management companies and employees have something in place that they can go to and make sure that the tenants in their buildings are aware of what's going on. And so we like to have it so that the 3-hour seminar isn't just us talking, it's more of a back and forth, an interactive seminar where we get feedback from the members. So we may ask them, well, do you have glow sticks in case the emergency lighting goes out? Because how long can you really think that the emergency lighting is going to stay? Sometimes they'll come back and say, oh, well, it's only going to last out 3 to 4 hours. Do you have glow sticks in place? Why shouldn't you use candles during emergency? So we get into a lot of these things that we talked about with the guidelines that are in place. So before an emergency, do you have everything written down or scanned so that you know who's in the building, who's not, so that after or during the emergency, you're aware of what's going on. During the emergency, what are some things that you're going to have in place? How do you react to what's going on in the news to make sure that you're at the forefront and ready to go when something happens? After, one of our sample questions is, how do you know when you're allowed to go back into the building or allow tenants back in if you've been evacuated? And it's a simple answer, but somebody might think, oh, if the superintendent says it's okay, then we can go back in the building. When in truth, it's the Department of Buildings who has the final say to say, if we evacuated the building, then they're the ones who are going to let you back in. And so after, we also get into how you restart the building, how you get things back to where they were from before. And again, it's not meant to be exhaustive, but it's meant for the building managers to get that information first, so that when they come to you as a management company and you're talking about your plans and what you guys want to do, they're already aware of what's going on. So I'll be here. We have some flyers to give out, and any information that you need, you can feel free to ask me any questions.
Okay, Stephen, did you have a comment or a question? Please. Good.
The part I heard was about planning, and one of the things that is really important as us as outside accountants with you folks as property managers is sort of things like are coming up this time of year, that we do the budget process and we're seeing a deficit for 2013, and mostly we're seeing everybody focuses on what do we need to do to 14. But what doesn't always happen is what do we do about the deficit for 13? And that's one of the issues in the selling guide, is recurring deficits, or the missing 10%. We talked about the funding for the reserves earlier in the presentation. And that's what I guess I want everybody to think about. As part of our work, we try to get the information, do the planning. We sort of call it dressing up the financial statement to make it the best possible presentation for the lender, for prospective buyers. And we're hearing that that's not always happening, that accountants and accounting is looked at after the fact. Well, that's what the numbers were. Well, we find out in March that we had this big deficit. Now the financial statement doesn't look good to the board, doesn't look good to the banks and the lenders, prospective purchasers. So I'd just like you guys to hear the part that was in the presentations about planning, that it's important to take a look at that and try to think of that and work with your accountants and your financial people within your management firms to try to get the best possible picture out there so that these loans do qualify as best they can.
Okay, so after this session, Alex, I just want you to raise your hand, because if any of you have any engineering questions or any engineering issues, make use of his knowledge. And at every lunch, or every function, we serve kosher food, but you have to ask Helen. And the reason you have to ask Helen is because everyone goes for the kosher food and they're not kosher. And so she gets to decide if you're qualified or not.
Talk about profiling.
So thank you, Helen. Perfect. Thank you, Frida D. Thank you, Rashad Adams. So with that, I hope to see you all on January 25th, which is our annual gala, our honorary gala at Leonard's of Great Neck. It truly is the best party in the industry. And then watch our website for all our fabulous programs coming up throughout the year. Thank you very much.
But we continue to work, and
Well, our lab was the first commercial DNA testing laboratory in the United States. We opened up in 1991, and we were recognized as the industry leader in the identification and detection of insects, pests, rodents, organisms, bacteria, all these types of components. So we've been doing this for many, many years, in excess of 20, starting with the federal government, all the way down to having 93% of the veterinarian business in the United States. We receive samples every day from all over the world, and we are regarded as the leading expert in what we do. Bug Lab came along and decided that it was now time, given what it was going on in the environment, to take these applied technologies and take them out of the laboratory and apply them into everyday living situations. So we are now testing all environments for things like MRSA, bacteria, mold.
What about Legionnaires?
Legionnaires disease
Okay,
and
good.
water supplies. Bed bugs, fleas, ticks. So we are able to do things that most laboratories cannot do. And although there are some laboratories that do some of what we do, we have a proprietary testing that allows us to do in hours what it takes them days, weeks, or months to do.
Okay, so when you say what they can't do, meaning you found a methodology that gets the results.
Well, it's a couple of different things. First of all, the ability to be able to do faster testing is dependent upon having equipment that is generally 10 times more expensive than the standard equipment being utilized by most facilities.
Okay.
It also requires enhanced and additional training over long periods of time, and a lot of it is kind of trial and error.
Okay.
It's also a lot of computer programming. But the real secret to what we've been able to do over the last 20 years is we have been able to enhance the process by which components of the DNA are extrapolated from the sample and tested. And because we have reworked this process, the re-engineering of this now not only makes our testing faster process, but it gives us more information that is more enhanced and more in-depth. So we can tell you things like how much of an infestation you have, how much of a concentration it is, and give you directions on what it is you need to be able to remediate the problem.
Okay. So that in the back end at the lab. So apparently, then you've made this convenient method to get it to the lab. So that makes the lab uber fabulous. So now, rather than as a building manager for years, we would take the Scotch tape and try to what is that? Take the Scotch tape, put it in something, and then try to find a lab to handle
We
it.
can, this is very convenient. We're testing everything from kitchens for salmonella.
Okay.
We're testing
surfaces.
mold. So
Okay.
any kind of surface, you can use this to go into a ventilation or an air return. Okay, you can use this to go on counters, baseboards, under sinks, into tight areas and walls. You can use this basically anywhere in any environment. You can do it in an office, you can do it on a desk, you can do it on a chair, you can do it anywhere.
Okay. So it's surfaces, and so while you're the disease organism or the organism, it's not what it isn't. So the public doesn't misunderstand. We're not testing, me to find out if I've got a bacteria somewhere. You're not testing the person having something. You're testing a surface. The surface could be on
The surface
person.
could be, but basically we are testing environments and we are testing humans externally. Okay? We are not a medical testing facility. We are an environment and veterinary testing facility. So we test things that are on surfaces, we are testing things that are in the air, and we are the expert for anything that is an animal insect pest.
So if a landlord has a rule against no dogs,
Yes.
and he wants to test to see if there's been dog DNA, bingo.
Absolutely. This test is very sensitive. First of all, we test for saliva, dander, blood, feces, and urine. So these are all the different things. This test is so sensitive that if you wake up in the morning and you notice that you've been bitten in the morning, if it's been less than 8 hours and you have not treated the bite, you can actually swab the skin and get actually a sample of dander or a sample of saliva and put it in this, and we will be able to tell you exactly what it is that bit you.
That's great. Now, in the environment sector, there's what's referred to as a third-party tester, and I see, and now a third-party tester may use this, but I don't see this as replacing the need for a third-party tester. So while a building staff person, the first sight, it's really first sight, building staff person, first sense, should take a sample.
Well, what this is this gives it. This is simple enough and quick enough that it can be used by anyone, any place. Now, we restrict access to this because certain tests we believe should only be performed by people who have certain experiences in certain areas. So we limit what tests are available to be purchased by whom. This test absolutely could and should be utilized by somebody who is very expensive, very experienced, and you know, and does this as a course of maybe some sort of legal proceeding, because our test is more sensitive and it is a quicker process. But the design was with the idea that routine maintenance workers, you know, building owners, people of this nature would be utilized.
Right, exactly, and that's and the sooner, because every position piece that an attorney might write on environmental lawsuits, the sooner you know, then the sooner you can react and you abate it accordingly. So in the end, it's when you need that third-party test. So a third-party testing company may use this, or they may use their own method to collect it. This is a collecting method, but it's really about the early detection.
It's all about the early detection.
By making it convenient,
Right.
then you're more prone to have the early detection.
Well, first of all, you're limiting the negative impact of early detection, and you are also limiting the cost of remediation and the issues that go with it. Bed bugs, for instance. If you catch it early when it's in your apartment, you're talking about one level of treatment. If it's spread through the walls into other units, you're talking about a whole nother level of problem solving,
Right.
which is increased time, increased expense, inconvenience, lawsuits.
Right. I mean, bed bugs can empty a building. Legionnaires certainly can empty a building.
Absolutely.
We've seen it happen time and time again.
Sure.
And so in theory, every contractor, every mechanic should have one in their bed pocket, because if you're right there in the air conditioning system, you're not going to go back there. You're there, this is handy, you reach for it.
And that's the reason that we chose this design, was for that very reason.
Okay, excellent. Okay, well, thank you, and we will continue this.
Directly both in New York and, you know, even help along with their colleagues in order
Do I have a card?
property manager.
Excellent.